Hello there, ICS4C folks. Today's lesson is 2_3 Introduction to Objects, and we had our Introduction to Objects earlier, and you've seen some on Code Academy, of course, but this is going to be our first big note and our first big lesson on them, and hopefully we'll sort of consolidate some of the learning that you've been doing on Code Academy. So you're looking at this page because there's three files that you need to get. There's a Smart Notebook file that's called 2_3. There's two JavaScript examples. And before you get going, you should probably have those three things open or at least handy. And remember, when I'm going through this lesson, and I have a feeling this one's going to be a fairly long lesson, pause and get some work done, and stop and take some notes, or stop and try some code, and go back and forth between these three files, I suppose, and between several programs. So it shouldn't be just you just listening and doing nothing. It should be more than that. All right, so you've got those three files from Edmodo, and that's the first one. And what I would suggest is, as we're going through this, if there's some note you want to add in a different color, just change the color to whatever. Here, change the color, and then you can put in your own notes. My own notes. Okay, whatever you want to do. I don't think there's going to be too much we add, but certainly if there's a thing when we're watching the video and in class and I'm busy or something like that, helping a different student, make a little note of it and then ask me to come over and explain it, okay? Because there's this stuff is new, and it shouldn't be too difficult, but it is a little strange compared to the stuff we've done so far in computer science. Okay, here we go. First of all, some review. There's two ways that we construct objects. This first one was what we call the constructor notation. So this line here, object name equals new object, that creates an object, but it's blank. There's no key value pairs at all. And then we can start attaching key value pairs using either dot notation or square bracket notation. So if I were to actually run this code, it would have this object name would have two keys, key 1 and key 2, and the values of those keys would be value 1 and value 2. If you actually ran this, because value 1 and value 2 don't exist, you'd probably get an error message. But you get the idea. And this is review. This is constructor notation. So we construct the object, then start attaching stuff to that object. The other way that we saw was what was called object literal notation. And in object literal notation, we literally defined the object and its key value pairs. So same name, object name, but then we explicitly say all the keys and their values. Notice there's a semicolon and commas rather than, up here, these are distinct JavaScript statements. This is a whole statement. And this is just sort of like inside this big object definition. Okay? Probably I should have a semicolon at the end of that, I think. Pretty sure. And if it doesn't, then either JSBin or Notepad would give you an error message there. I think we need a semicolon there, but I'll check again during the lesson. That's review. And even if we use literal notation, it doesn't mean we can't attach new things to an old object that we've created. And we had some, we were goofing around with this a little bit in the previous days. First new thing, objects and functions. A function that is connected to an object is called a method. And this is common in more than just JavaScript, this terminology, to call this a method. So any function, any ability, any, we thought of a function as kind of like a subprogram that did a bunch of steps. When we attach it to an object, it's called a method. Okay? no big whoop. In constructor notation, this is what it looks like. So we have our object that we created that was blank. We attached a few key values, and then we're going to attach a function where, I'm going to start calling them methods, because as soon as we attach it to an object, it's called a method. And a method usually has some verb attached to it. So do method equals, and then a very familiar notation here, function, and then the function could have some parameters in there, and it doesn't have to, but we could have some parameters in there. And then inside this would be whatever we wanted our method or function to do. Okay, so this is kind of like our subprogram, but it's attached to object name. It's not something that we can access. We couldn't say just do method outside of having an object dot do method. We couldn't just do method, and I'll explain that once we get to an example. However, in literal notation, we know that we've got our object that we defined, and there's the key values. And then, in just the same way, or similar way, we have, instead of having key 3, we have our method name, which is do method, and then a colon, and then the function and whatever we want the function to do. And this behaves in the same way that we had up here with the object constructor notation. Okay? And this is like the general notation. In both cases, we'd actually use our method by doing this. Okay, so console.log object name.do method, and then the matching parameters. So this can be blank, but this here would match that list of parameters. Whatever was in here would have to match whatever was in here. And not the same names. Remember, it's kind of like when we call a method outside, usually these are the values. When we call a method outside in here, those are the values that are kind of thrown into the function and used to calculate for a calculation or whatever the function does. And we'll see that once we get to an example. It says, note, the line above works if the method returns something. So for instance, if this do method returns a value or returns a message or whatever, then it would, that message that was returned would be put out to the console. If it just does something, itself, like it prints a message in the thing itself, or it just, calculates something or whatever, then we could just call the method object.name do method, and then this line would represent running the method or running the function. And again, we'll see this soon when we get to an example. And I think it feels like we need an example so you understand what the heck I'm talking about here. And remember, if you're have questions and I'm not available to come over and answer them right away, make a little note of it, and we'll come back to it. Please ask lots of questions in this section. All right, so here's the example. Get intro to objects example.js from Edmodo. So this is our first example, and these are the things that I'm actually going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all these things. This is an example, and I think I have this one open in Notepad. Yes, I do. I have mine open in Notepad. Remember, to use your Notepad thing, you have to have your JavaScript skeleton and a connection to that JavaScript, right? And then from here, we'd run the HTML, not the JavaScript, but we'd launch the HTML in Chrome. But this is what we're going to be looking at for the most part. Okay. And we'll get to it in a second. Let's explain some of the code first. So in comments, it says the student object in literal notation. So this is a student, and student's got, looks like, 4 key value pairs. Name, locker, marks is an array, and then the 4th one, calcav, is a function. We see right here, this is a function. And what does the function do? Well, calcav, I'm guessing it's going to calculate the average. And notice that it has another variable total, but that's used in this function. That's like a local variable. And then it goes for I in student.marks. So this means it's going to loop through that array, which is student.marks, total equals total plus student.marks I. And there's our dot notation accessing the values in the array that's attached to student. And then it's going to return the total divided by the length. And notice that student.marks.length, it's kind of like a chain action. Remember, if I wanted to, marks.length, that just goes to the array marks and figures out how many there are, and then student.marks, while student.marks attaches itself to this array. So student.marks.length will return 4. So it's going to do this total and divide by 4. So let's we'll get to that in a second. What else is going on? We have a function, and this is a silly little stupid function that says say hello, and it's got two parameters, who and where. Hello, welcome to room where, dot, and then whose room. And I'll show you that that's just a function later, just a normal old function. And then we have another object called the teacher object, and this is constructed using constructor notation. This line creates a blank object, then we attach a name in dot notation, a room in square bracket notation, and then teacher.greeting is a method, because what I've done is this plain old function and we attached it to teacher. It's actually called greeting in teacher though, and then down here we actually use it. So I'm going to get into the code here in a second. Accessing data. So the first thing we're going to show you is to remind you how to access data. So when I go to the code, what I'm going to do for the start is I'm actually going to comment out this, and if I'm going to run this, and if I just want, I'm going to comment this one out too. If I just want to access some data, remember, I'm going to just put it out to the console.log. What would I like to access? Maybe the teacher name. And that's going to actually just print out the teacher name, which should be Mr. Ferd. And I'm going to save that and launch that in Chrome. F12. And if you're using JSBin, that's fine too. So there's Mr. Ferd. So that's how I access data. What's more interesting for me is actually getting a chance to run that method. So if I want to run the method, this is going to actually go student.calcav. Now notice, because it's a function, those two brackets are there. And notice in this case, calc function, it expects no parameters. Expects no parameters. There's no parameters in there. It's just going to run student.calcav. So if I save this and I'm going to refresh, it actually console.log the program, the calcav, ran through this, calculated the average, and then printed out what it returned. Returns total dot, well, Ferd's, or the student's average, not Ferd's average, was 57. Notice that if I left this off, if I left off this, what would that look like? I'm going to save that and just show you some error messages here. See, so it printed, actually, what did it do? It console logged the function itself. It actually printed out the code, not an error message. It didn't run the code. It just printed out what the function was. Is that any good? Well, maybe we'd want that at some point, but to actually run the code, we have to include the brackets and whatever parameters are in there. All right, so let's put that back in there. What's next in our list of stuff to talk about? Printing objects to C key value pairs. So remember, and we saw this last time, if I just wanted to print out the entire object, let's print out the two objects. So I'm going to, instead of calcav, I'm going to print out student, and I'm going to print out teacher. And that's printing out the entire object. So it's going to have all the key value pairs. So I'm going to refresh this. there's object Ferd, locker, marks is an array, Mr. Ferd, and room was 456. Dandy. That's printing out the entire object, gives us all the key value pairs. Dandy. What was next? So function versus procedure methods. So again, function versus procedure. We talked about this a little bit in grade 11. We can think of a function as something that does something and returns a value to the main program. So because there's a return value in CalcAv, return value in CalcAv, we couldn't just, for instance, let me get back to my program. We couldn't just have student.calcav, because that prints something. I'm going to comment this out. Because this returns the value 57, this whole line would be just like having a mark 57 sitting there. I don't think this will give us an error message, but it is a bit goofy. If we wanted something to be done with the 57, we'd actually have to, print it out to the console, or have it equal to a new variable, average, or something like that. If I just have this line, it doesn't make much sense. Let's just see what that actually does. Nothing. It does nothing because we didn't print it out to the screen. We didn't assign it to a new variable. It's just sitting in no man's land. So this is what I would call a function. A procedure is something that just does something. Like say hello just does something. So for instance, in the teacher.greeting, which we actually greeting, right in this line right here, we said, well, greeting is just the function say hello. And so teacher.greeting, notice it, I'm not doing console.log bracket teacher.greeting. I'm just saying teacher.greeting. So this is actually what we call a procedure. It just does something. It's not returning a value that we have to deal with. It just does something. So if I were to refresh this, let's have a look. And there's the message. Hello, welcome to room 666, Mrs. Fran's room. I want to sort of point out something that's a little goofy here. That even though we ran the method teacher.greeting, which teacher was Mr. Ferd and the room was 456, it actually just used the parameters for that that method call. It used Mrs. Fran for who and where for the room, and I don't think that's quite what we want. I think we would have liked teacher.greeting to say, hello, welcome to room 456, Mr. Ferd's room, I think is what we would have liked it to say. But we'll get to that in a moment. What I wanted to mention is that this didn't have console.log teacher.greeting. This was what we'd call a procedure. It just does something and then returns flow of control back to the normal program. All right. I'm going to pause there. Where are we? We did that, and that. So in part 2, I'm going to pick it up right here in part 2.